Zoom meeting makeup session here. We are going to talk today about flowers. We're going to talk about pollination. We're going to talk about flowers and fruit. So if you want to find this presentation, you're going to go to either your horticulture, week 9, or if you were in my roots class, you're going to go to roots horticulture, week 9. Go in there. Both classes are going to have the exact same folder here, and you can click on this presentation here to follow along with me. All right, but I have it up here. I'm just going to double check to make sure I'm recording. Looks like we're good. All right, so I'm going to go through this presentation fairly quickly. Please feel free to pause, take notes if you'd like to at any point. If you have any questions, you can email me. If you're my student, you should know my email or a way to contact me via Schoology. So first of all, you're going to take a look here at our basic flower. This is a very basic anatomical flower here. This is what you're seeing, a complete flower, which we're going to talk a little bit more about. I'm just going to briefly go over the different sections of it. So first of all, you're going to see the pink section here is representing the petals, which show color. We'll talk a little bit more about that, to attract pollinators. And pollinators is anything that transfers pollen from one flower to another. We'll talk about examples of that a little bit later. First, let's go over here to the female reproductive part of the flower. Now, we're going to talk today about the purpose of flowers, but the biggest purpose is for reproduction and the continuation of DNA for the next generation. So flowers here, some of them do have both male and female reproductive sections. Some only have male and some only have female. A complete flower is going to have both male, female, petals, and sepals. So you it travels down the style and the pollen tube into the ovary here. And the ovary is where there's ovules. Ovules is the word, essentially what we'd use for humans is eggs. So these are unfertilized ovules until pollen is deposited, and then they can develop into seeds, which would then be a new embryo for the plant, a new baby plant, essentially. We talked about seeds. That is all the DNA, all the genetic material, and all of the nutrient package and protection that a seed needs to start a new plant. So that is the female part of the flower. We have the stigma, the style, which contains a pollen tube, which transfers it into the ovary and will fertilize the ovules. The male part of the flower is a little simpler. All it is an anther and filament. The filament essentially is just support for the anther. The anther here, you'll watch a video here in a moment. Essentially, it turns itself inside out and presents pollen, which is going to have that scent. It's going to attract pollinators via a different scent or different sense than just sight of the beautiful petals. We're going to talk about different ways pollination happens, but one of them is even self-pollination, where a flower can pollinate itself, where an anther, well, essentially, they're very close together. The stigma and the anther is very close together, and they're able to pollinate itself. It can also happen where a flower on the same plant, so if you have like a blueberry bush, it's able to pollinate itself via pollinators. It doesn't need another plant to be able to do so. The last section here of the flower is the sepal, and this is protection of the flower buds. So essentially, when you still see a flower bud that hasn't bloomed yet, the sepal is going to protect it. And then now that the flower has bloomed, it does act as support for the flower. So when we talk about flowering plants, we're talking about angiosperms, which we're going to see here at the very end of this evolutionary timeline. We'll talk a little bit more about this later on in the year, but when we start off here with the most basic of evolutionary plants, we're talking about algae, single-celled photosynthetic, the ability to do photosynthesis plants. And then over time, plants are able to develop to have tons of different characteristics. But really, only gymnosperms and angiosperms, known as flowering plants, contain seeds. So ferns use spores, but then gymnosperms, things like hemlock, cedar, pine trees, any type of coniferous or coniferous, things that contain cones, that is called a naked seed. Gymno meaning naked, sperm meaning seed. A naked seed because the pine cone has no protection, right? It is just the seeds. An angiosperm, however, the seeds are protected within a flower and a fruit. And so this is what we're talking about here is angiosperms. These are plants that contain flowers. Obviously, you know, when you look at a big pine tree or a big cedar, it's not going to have flowers. Ferns don't have flowers. Mosses, hornworts, liverworts, algae, none of those are flowering plants. Only angiosperms go through this process for reproduction. So talking here a little bit about the purpose. So they are the reproductive system for that plant, and they are creating the embryo for the next generation. It requires genetic material being combined. So we have pollen and then ovule. In humans or mammals, we use sperm and an egg. So pollen and an ovule are combining genetic material to start a seed, start an embryo. So we have here, the also big purpose of flowers is to attract pollinators, because a lot of times a plant needs something to transfer pollen to another flower. So for example, here, you can see that birds, bees, bats, humans, butterflies, anything that can get a little bit of pollen on its nose, you smell another flower, you're transferring pollen from one to the next. So you're doing the plant's bidding. Pollinators, like I said, are transferring from one to the next to allow to fertilize the plant. All right, so if you are on my in my Schoology class, you can go ahead and I would click on that presentation. It's going to show a time lapse of a flower developing. You're going to see the bloom of pollen on a pear tree. And after it's been pollinated, it then turns into a fruit. And the seeds have been protected inside here in this little tomato. All right, self-pollination. So self-pollination can happen in two ways. A flower can pollinate itself. Also, flowers on the same plant pollinating one or the other, where you don't need another plant to help you do it. So pollen is, you can see here, the anther is going onto the stigma. This can also happen on the same plant. Some examples of this are tomatoes, green peppers, chili peppers, eggplants, green beans, lima beans, peanuts, and it doesn't require, technically, not all, you know, I'm going to take back this here. Sometimes it still needs a pollinator to help. When it's its own system here, it doesn't need a pollinator, probably needs a little bit of wind to help jostle it around. But you know what, sometimes when it is on different flowers, it does require a pollinator. So I'm going to go ahead and cross this out here. I made a quick mistake. Cross-pollination always requires a pollinator to help. I guess what I should say is sometimes doesn't require a pollinator to help. So cross-pollination is the transfer of pollen from one flower to the stigma of a different flower or same species. So for example, a pollinator taking pollen from one blueberry bush to the next blueberry bush. So they're going to a different plant, and it always requires a pollinator to help. A complete flower versus an incomplete flower. Like I said earlier, a complete flower is going to have sepals at the bottom, petals attracting. It's going to have a female reproductive system and a male reproductive system. If the flower is missing any of those parts, it's considered an incomplete flower. It's an incomplete flower. Now, if something gets cut off the plant, it doesn't mean it's automatically an incomplete flower, because biologically it was supposed to be a complete flower. All right, so a kiwi plant is a great example of an incomplete flower because they have male and female flowers, essentially. Where, so you can see here on the left, this is actually an example of a peach. I just used it though, because I know kiwi plants. And if you've ever been to Grub here in Olympia, you can see that they have a really beautiful kiwi plant. And so you're going to have here, this one here does not have any stigma. It only has anthers. And this one here does not have any anthers, only stigma. All right, so let's talk a little bit here more about pollinators and what they see. So when we look here at the light spectrum, you and I have limitations about what we can see. We cannot see ultraviolet. We can also not see infrared. When we're thinking about, you remember back to like 9th grade physics and 9th grade physical science, different wavelengths produce different light, and our eyes can only accept and be able to translate essentially different wavelengths of light. And so you and I, we see the rainbow. We see what we consider to be the rainbow. So red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet. However, bees are slightly shifted here on their vision and what wavelengths they can interpret. So they really can't see orange and red very well, but they can see yellow, green, blue, violet, and ultraviolet. So flowers, they're trying to attract pollinators, right? They want to attract bees. And so they use some kind of marketing techniques to say, hey, this is where the pollen's at, because the flower wants the bees, the pollinators, to transfer pollen from one flower to the next. And so they kind of create this ultraviolet runway to say, this is what you want right here. This is what you want right here, the pollen. So you can see here on the right, this is what we would see on the left. We'd see some reds, we'd see some yellows, but here, this is what bees would see. It's kind of like a little treasure. This is where the pollen is at. All right, so just to sum up here today, we talked about different parts of the flower. We talked about evolution of what plants do have flowers and the purpose of those flowers and fruit. We talked about how a flower turns into fruit, as well as what is a complete flower, what's an incomplete flower, and the function and purpose of pollinators. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. The assignments here you're going to see is something called the Basics and Beauty of Pollination. There's a short YouTube video to watch, and then there's some questions. Let me know if I can help you out with those.